Section 3 of The Adventures of Chatterer the Red Squirrel by Thornton W. Burgess. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jude Summers. Section 3. How Chatterer Had Fooled Peter Rabbit, Chatterer Grows Careless, and Chatterer Grows Too Curious. Chapter 7. How Chatterer Had Fooled Peter Rabbit. Chatterer the Red Squirrel is a scamp himself and not to be trusted. Nobody in the Green Forest or on the Green Meadows trusts him. And people who cannot be trusted themselves never trust anyone else. Chatterer never does. He is always suspicious. So when Peter Rabbit had said goodbye and started for the dear old briar-patch without knowing where Chatterer's new home was, Chatterer made up his mind right away that Peter would never be satisfied until he knew, or thought he knew, where that new house was. You see, he knew all about Peter's dreadful curiosity. He watched Peter out of sight. Then he slipped down out of sight himself between the stones of the old wall. "I know what Peter will do," said he to himself. "Peter will come sneaking back and hide where he can watch me, and so find out where my new house is. I'll just stay here long enough to give him a chance to hide, and then I'll fool him." You see, Chatterer knew that if he had been in Peter's place, he would have done just that thing. So he waited a little while and then went back to the place where Peter had left him. There he sat and pretended to be looking in the direction in which Peter had gone, as if to make sure that Peter was really on his way home. But all the time Chatterer was watching out of the corners of his eyes to see if Peter was hiding anywhere near. He didn't see Peter, but he didn't have the least doubt that Peter was somewhere about. After a while he ran over to a hole between the stones of the old wall and pretended to be very busy there, just as if it really were the new house he had found. He kept popping in and out and looking around as if afraid that someone was watching him. He even got some dry leaves and took them inside, as if to make a bed. All the time, although he hadn't seen a sign of Peter, he didn't have the least doubt in the world that Peter was watching him. And when he grew tired, a new idea popped into his shrewd little head. He popped out of the hole and sat up on the wall. Then he said aloud that verse which had made Peter's ears burn so. He had meant to make Peter's ears burn. He said that verse just as if he really did believe that Peter was not spying on him and was glad of it. When he had finished, he whisked out of sight again to give Peter a chance to get away. But this time Chatterer did some peeking himself. He hid where Peter couldn't see him, but where he himself could see both ways along the old stone wall. And so it was that he saw Peter crawl out from under the little bush where he had been hiding, and sneak away in the direction of the old briar-patch. And he knew that this time Peter had gone for good. Then Chatterer laughed and laughed to think how he had fooled Peter Rabbit, and wished that he could pat himself on the back for being so smart. He didn't once think of how dishonest and mean it was of Peter to spy on him, because, you see, he would have done the same thing himself. "One has to keep one's wits very sharp these days to keep a secret," chuckled Chatterer. But over in the old briar-patch that afternoon, Peter Rabbit sat very thoughtful and very much ashamed. The thought that he had found out where Chatterer's new house was didn't give him the pleasure that he had thought it would. His ears still burned, for he thought that Chatterer supposed him honest when he wasn't. "I believe I'll go over tomorrow and tell Chatterer all about it and how mean I have been," said he at last. And when he made up his mind to do this, he felt better. And all the time he hadn't found Chatterer's new house at all. You see, it was the old home of Drummer the Woodpecker in an old apple tree, which Chatterer had decided to live in. Chapter 8. Chatterer Grows Careless. When you grow careless, even though it be in matters small, old Mr. Trouble you will find is bound to make a call. Some people never seem to learn that. You would suppose that after all the trouble and worry Chatterer the Red Squirrel had had, he would have learned a lesson. For a while it seemed as if he had. Morning after morning, before anyone was up in Farmer Brown's house, he visited Farmer Brown's corn crib, taking the greatest care not to be seen, and to get back to his home in the old orchard before it was time for Farmer Brown's boy to come out and do his morning's work. And in the corn crib he took the greatest care to steal only where what he took would not be missed. The empty cobs from which he had eaten the corn he hid in the darkest corner behind the great pile of yellow corn, where they would not be found until nearly all the corn had been taken from the crib. Oh, he was very sly and crafty, was Chatterer the Red Squirrel. At first. But after a while, when nothing happened, Chatterer grew careless. At first it had seemed very dangerous to go over to the corn crib, but after he had been there often, it didn't seem dangerous at all. Once inside, he would just give himself up to having a good time. He raced about over the great pile of beautiful yellow corn and found the loveliest hiding places in it. Down in a dark corner he made a splendid bed from pieces of husk which hadn't been stripped from some of the ears. It was quite the nicest place he had ever dreamed of, was Farmer Brown's corn crib. He got to feeling that it was his own, and not Farmer Brown's at all. The more that feeling grew, the more careless Chatterer became. He dropped a grain of corn now and then, and was too lazy to go down and pick it up, or else didn't think anything about it. Farmer Brown's boy, coming every morning for corn for the hens, noticed these grains, but supposed they were some that had been rubbed from the ears during the handling of them. Then one morning Chatterer dropped a cob from which he had eaten all the corn. He meant to get it and hide it, as he had hidden other cobs, but he didn't want to do it just then. And later, well, then he forgot all about it. Yes, sir, he forgot all about it until he reached his home in the old orchard. "Oh, well," thought Chatterer, "it doesn't matter. I can get it and hide it tomorrow morning." Now, a corn cob is a very simple thing. Farmer Brown's boy knew where there was a whole pile of them. He added to that pile every day after shelling enough corn for the biddies. So it would seem that there was nothing about a corn cob to make him open his eyes, as he did that morning when he saw the one left by Chatterer the Red Squirrel. But you see, he knew that a bare corn cob had no business inside the corn crib, and suddenly those scattered grains of corn had a new meaning for him. "Ha ha!" he exclaimed. "A thief has been here after all. I thought we were safe from rats and mice, and I don't see how they got in, for I really don't, see how they could climb the stone legs of the corn crib. But someone with sharp teeth certainly has been in here. It must be that I have left the door open for some time, and a rat has slipped in. I'll just have to get you, Mr. Rat or Mr. Mouse. We can't have you in our corn crib." With that he went into the house. Presently he came back, and in one hand was a rat trap, and in the other a mouse trap. Chapter 9. Chatterer Grows Too Curious. Everybody knows how curious Peter Rabbit is. He is forever poking his wobbly little nose in where it has no business to be, and as a result Peter is forever getting into trouble. Whenever Chatterer the Red Squirrel has heard a new story about Peter and the scrapes his curiosity has got him into, Chatterer has said that Peter got no more than he deserved. As for himself, he might be curious about a thing he saw for the first time, but he had too much sense to meddle with it until he knew all about it. So Chatterer has come to be thought very smart, quite too smart to be caught in a trap. At least, to be caught in an ordinary trap. Now a great many people manage to make their neighbors think they are a great deal smarter than they really are, and Chatterer is one of this kind. If some of his neighbors could have peeped into Farmer Brown's corn crib the morning after Farmer Brown's boy found the telltale corn cob so carelessly dropped by Chatterer, they would have been surprised. Yes, sir, they would have been surprised. They would have seen Chatterer the Red Squirrel, the boaster, he of the sharp wits, showing quite as much curiosity as ever possessed Peter Rabbit. Chatterer had come over to the corn crib, as usual, to get his daily supply of corn. As usual, he had raced about over the great pile of yellow corn. Quite suddenly, his sharp eyes spied something that they hadn't seen before. It was down on the floor of the corn crib, quite near the door. Chatterer was sure that it hadn't been there the day before. It was a very queer-looking thing, very queer indeed. And then he spied another queer-looking thing near it, only this was very much smaller. What could they be? He looked at them suspiciously. They looked harmless enough. They didn't move. He ran a few steps towards them and scolded, just as he scolds at anything new he finds out of doors. Still, they didn't move. He ran around on a little ledge where he could look right down on the queer things. He was sure now that they were not alive. The biggest one he could see all through. Inside was something to eat. The littlest one was round and flat, with funny bits of wire on top. It looked as if it were made of wood, and in the sides were little round holes too small for him to put his head through. "Leave them alone," said a small voice inside of Chatterer. "But I want to see what they are and find out all about them," said Chatterer. "No good ever comes of meddling with things you don't know about," said the small voice. "But they're such queer-looking things, and they're not alive. They can't hurt me," said Chatterer. Nevertheless, he ran back to the pile of corn and tried to eat. Somehow he had lost his appetite. He couldn't take his eyes off those two queer things down on the floor. "Better keep away," warned the small voice inside. "It won't do any harm to have a closer look at them," said Chatterer. So once more he scrambled down from the pile of corn and, little by little, drew nearer to the two queer things. The nearer he got, the more harmless they looked. Finally, he reached out and smelled of the smallest. Then he turned up his nose. "Smells of mice," muttered Chatterer. "Just common barn mice." Then he reached out a paw and touched it. "Pooh!" said he. "It's nothing to be afraid of." Just then he touched one of the little wires, and there was a sudden snap. It frightened Chatterer so that he scurried away. But he couldn't stay away. That snap was such a funny thing, and it hadn't done any harm. You see, he hadn't put his paw in at one of the little holes, or it might have done some harm. Pretty soon he was back again, meddling with those little wires on top. Every once in a while there would be a snap, and he would scamper away. It was very scary and great fun. By and by the thing wouldn't snap any more, and then Chatterer grew tired of his queer plaything and began to wonder about the other queer thing. No harm had come from the first, so he was sure no harm could come from the other. End of section 3.